Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. Boker Tov. Okay. Yud Aleph Amud Aleph at the top. We are 1, 2, 3 lines from the top, and we did actually shiur in the daf yesterday. So we're this is where we left off. Va'amar Rava bar Machasya Amar Rav Chama bar Guria Amar Rav. These are a collection of statements by this group. Rava bar Machasya is reporting in the name of Rav Chama bar Guria and the name of Rav. Kol ir shegagotea givoin mi bet knesset lesof hareva. Any city whose roofs are higher than that of the synagogue will eventually be destroyed. Doesn't sound too good. Shene'emar leromem et bet Eloheinu ule'amid et chorvotav, because it says to uplift the house of our God and to establish its ruins. Meaning to say that if a person, if people build their houses, if people build the Beit HaMikdash rather as the highest building in the neighborhood, that will mean that the ruins will be rebuilt, will be established. But if they don't uplift, liromem, to uplift the house of our God means to place it at the top, at the pinnacle of all the other structures. So if it's not the highest structure in the area, so that means the opposite, that the ruins will not be fixed, will not be repaired. This is only talking about private homes. But if we're talking about various kinds of towers and things like that are not for dwelling. So we're not talking about those things. It's not that the water tower has to be shorter than the Beit Knesset or something like that. We're talking about private homes. There shouldn't be private homes that are so lavish and so tall that they overshadow the Beit Knesset. Amar Rav Ashi said, "Ana avdel matam mechasya delo harva." So he said, because of me, Matam Mechasya, which was a very famous city in the times of the Talmud, was not destroyed because I made everybody construct their homes shorter than the Bet Knesset, than the Batei Knesset. Probably there were many of them. But wait a second. V'acharva. But what are you talking about? It was destroyed. So what do you mean I prevented it from being destroyed? Me'oto avon lo charva. The answer is that from that sin it wasn't destroyed. Okay, it was destroyed from something else. What can I do? I saved it from one possible reason for destruction. The fact that they had other avonot, that I couldn't save it from everything. Rav bar Machasya said that Rav Chama bar Guria said that Rav said, Tachat Yishmael, better to serve an Arab, velo tachat nochri, but not to serve a nochri. Here, a nochri means a Roman, but the Talmud was fixed and censored. They didn't want to get into too much trouble because at a certain point Romans became associated with the Christians, and the Christians didn't really like that, so they got tachat nochri v'lo tachat chaver. Here, a chaver means the Persians. It says better to be under the dominion of the Romans than the Persians. Okay, this is not talking about the Jewish Persians. They're nice. We're talking about the other Persians. Tachat chaver v'lo tachat talmid chacham. But it's better to serve a Persian and not serve a Talmid Chacham. Why? Because the onesh, if you anger or you cause distress or disappointment to the Talmid Chacham, is much more severe. So perhaps the Persian will be a little bit tougher with you, but the Talmid Chacham, the seriousness of disobeying or causing pain to the Talmid Chacham is even worse. Tachat Talmid Chacham v'lo tachat yatom v'almana. But better to be the servant of a Talmid Chacham than a yatom v'almana, than an orphan or a widow, because we know that the Torah tells us that a person who causes any kind of suffering to an orphan or a widow, oy vavoy, to that person, that the terrible consequences of that. Rav bar Machasya said that Rav Chama bar Guria said that Rav said, Kol choli v'lo choli me'ayim. It's better to have any sickness, but not the sickness of the intestines. Stomach pain is the worst. We know that stomach virus is the worst. It's true. Kol kev v'lo kev lev, any kind of pain, but not pain in the heart. Kol mechush v'lo mechush rosh, any kind of ache, but not a headache. Headaches are the worst. We know that this is certainly true even today. The worst thing is like a migraine headache is the worst. Kol ra'ah v'lo isha ra'ah, any bad thing in your life, but not a bad woman. Because if a person has a bad wife, we know that their life is a disaster. Because they, no matter what's happening, if they know that they have a bad wife to come home to, they can't be a happy person. They're going to have terrible suffering, and this is certainly true. That's a whole other story. And Rav bar Machasya said that Rav Chama bar Guria said that Rav said, Im yu kol hayamim Now, this is a very important word, by the way. Kol yamim. This was in the parasha this week. This is an aside. There's a sidebar for a second. What's the difference between yamim and yamim? People say there's no difference, right? One is that I'm stuttering, and the other one is that I'm saying it, right? No. Yamim, without a dagesh, is days. Because there's a kamatz under the yud, the mem loses the dagesh. This is very technical, but it's extremely important. The difference between yamim and yamim. Ulemikveh mayim kara yamim. Okay, to the collection of water he called oceans or seas. Okay, that's yamim. Whenever it says in Tanakh yamim with the dagesh and the mem, it's referring to bodies of water, not to days. Whenever the word yamim has a kamatz under the yud, and therefore no dagesh in the mem, it's referring to days. In our parasha of this week, there's a big difference. I've said this one many times before. It's perhaps my personal favorite, that there's a big difference between an amma and an amma. Because an amma is a maidservant, and an amma is a measurement. And if Noach builds his teva out of 300 maidservants, it's certainly not going to be seaworthy or useful. If he builds it 300 amot, it's different. Yes? Right, that's also true. Right. Anenu is, please torture us. We don't want that. Anenu is, please answer us. There's a difference. Okay. So, anyway, it means if all the oceans were they were all ink, so all the oceans in the world are ink, V'agamim kol mosim, and all of the reeds in all of the marshes in the world were to be made into pens. V'shamayim yiriot, and the heavens were parchment. V'chol bnei adam lavdarim, and all of the human beings in the world were scribes. En maspikin lichtov chalala shel rashut. You wouldn't be able to write the depth. You wouldn't be able to exhaust. In other words, even if you were writing infinitely, what it's trying to say is it's inexhaustible, the depth of what goes into government or governance, okay? The depth of what's necessary to be able to govern properly. What Rashi says is to understand omek libam, the depth of their hearts. שהוא צריך להיות לו לב לכמה מדינות למס הקצוב ולכמה מלחמות ולכמה משפטים והכל ביום אחד. Multitasking, basically. A person has to measure the amount of taxes of different places and wars, and he has to judge. There's so much to manage. There's so much multitasking. It's truly an inexhaustible subject. Mikra, where do we see this from? Amar Rav Mishasheh. Rav Mishasheh says, Shamayim larum ve'eretz la'omek, as it says, the heavens in height and the land in depth. This is from Mishlei, I believe. V'lev Melachim en Cheker, but the heart of the king. Yes, it's in Melachim Cafe. I'm sorry, Mishlei Cafe. That the heavens to height and the land to depth. V'aretz la'omek v'lev Melachim en Cheker. There is no discernment of the heart of the kings. In other words, that even if you were to go up to the heavens, or you were to go down to the bottom of the sea, you'll never exhaust or fathom completely the heart of the king. As you can see, there's a pattern here. These are all teachings that came from the same chain of tradition. Rav Bar Machasya says that Rav Chama Bar Guria says that Rav says Yafet Tanit Chalom. Yafat Tanit LaChalom Ke'esh LeNeoret, that a fast is for a dream like fire is for flax. In other words, it eliminates whatever the badness of the dream is very, very quickly, just like lighting a fire to the most flammable material around burns it up. Meaning, what? It's saying like a very, very light straw, like straw. Yeah, like straw that burns really quickly. So what it's saying is that whatever the bad thing is about the dream, whether it's telling you something that's bad is going to happen, or it's telling you to do teshuvah, if a person fasts and they do teshuvah, then whatever that bad dream was intimating to them will be eliminated very quickly. Amar Rav Chizda uvo bayom, but that's only if you fast right after having had the dream. Va'amar Rav Yosef afilo b'Shabbat, and Rav Yosef says even on Shabbat. Of course, the Shulchan Aruch says that many people say today that we don't do this anymore. We don't do a Tanit Chalom on Shabbat because we don't understand the interpretation of dreams anymore like they did in those days to know what dream really is worthy of fasting on Shabbat. Rabbi Yoshua Brei de Ravidi iklal be Rav Ashi. Once upon a time, Rabbi Yoshua Brei de Ravidi was at the house of Rav Ashi. Avdele iglat tilta. They made for him the finest kind of steak, which was a calf that was the third to its mother. Why was that the best? Because the first two, the mother was still young, the babies didn't come out as robust, but by the third calf, that was considered the finest delicacy. And they prepared him a delicious dinner. Amrule, they said to him, Litomar midi, will you please have some? He said, no, I'm sorry, it's not kosher enough because it's not under the OU and the star K, but that's not... he didn't say that. Amar lo, he said, no, Betanit yativna, I'm fasting today. Amrule, they said to him, V'lo savar le'mar lahad Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav Yehuda, Lo ve'adam tanito porea. Did you not follow what Rav Yehuda said? Rav Yehuda said a person can borrow on his fast and pay it back later. In other words, if you took a fast upon yourself, you could say, oh, there's a sudat mitzvah comes up, some kind of mitzvah comes up, or an opportunity that you don't normally have, and you want to be able to take advantage of it. So you say, you know what, I'm going to cancel my fast today, I'm going to borrow this fast, and I'm going to pay it back another day. Amarle said, Tanit chalomo. I can't do that because it's a Tanit chalom. It is a fast for a dream, and a fast for a dream has to be on the same day. Amarav abar machasi amarav chama barguya amarav yafat tanit lachalom keshlani ored v'amarav chizda uvo bayom v'amarav Yosef afilu b'Shabbat. So he quoted back the entire sugya that we just saw, that a fasting for a bad dream is like lighting fire to straw, basically. It's a quick way to remedy whatever the problem is. And whether you understand bad dreams psychologically or prophetically, in other words, if you understand them prophetically, that there's some intimation that something bad is going to happen, then doing teshuvah by fasting is the quickest way to fix it. If you understand it psychologically, that the person is distraught by the dream, also the best way to fix feeling distraught is to do teshuvah and to have the reassurance and the comfort that you have a closeness to God, that you don't have to fear anything because you have that closeness to Hashem that's been established. Now, incidentally, this is not so simple that you can simply accept the fast upon yourself and lo ve'adam tanito porea. It's not that simple. It's a very complex subject in Masekhet Tanit and Hilchot Taniot, so it's not to mean that you don't take it that simply. It's talking about a person who decides to fast a certain number of times, and then he says, you know what, I'm going to fulfill my fast number 1 tomorrow, and then he didn't realize there's a Brit Milah or something like that, so he can always do it another day. But if he designated a specific day, then he's not able to, if he said, I'm going to fast on a specific day, a specific date, he can't just cancel the fast. It's only when he had made a commitment to a certain number of days and he was distributing them, and he decided to do this day, and then he found out that day was a conflict, now he can change it. But it's a long topic, so don't necessarily think, on Tzom Gedalia there's a great party going on, I'm going to just pay back the fast another day. You can't do that. So now we said like this. So in the Mishnah, it talked about several activities one is not supposed to undertake once the time of Mincha rolls around, because we don't want a person to forget to pray Mincha. However, it said, if you started one of these illicit activities that you weren't supposed to, you can finish it, you don't have to interrupt in order to say the tefillah, as long as, presuming there's enough time left in the afternoon to say mincha, you don't have to interrupt. But then it said, mafsikin the kriyat shema and mafsikin the tefillah. Then it said, we interrupt for the shema, but we don't interrupt for tefillah. We don't interrupt for prayer. So why did it repeat that? That's redundant. We already know that you don't have to interrupt. If you started one of these activities, you don't have to interrupt for prayer. So to what is this referring? Hatana leresha in mafsikin. But we already learned this. So what is the chidush? What is being added at the end of the Mishnah? Sefa atan the divrei Torah. What the end is talking about is the words of Torah. The Tanya, as it says in the Braita, Chaverim shayoskim b'Torah, mafsikin the kriyat shema and mafsikin the tefillah. That it says that a person who's involved, Chaverim, this is not the Chaver of before, the bad Persians. This is talking about Chaverim, Talmidei Chachamim, who are studying Torah, and the time comes for tefillah. They have to, if the time comes for the Shema, that's Deoraita, that's Min HaTorah, they have to stop and they have to say the Shema. But if it's a matter of tefillah, if it's a matter of prayer, they can skip the prayer. It's only the Rabbanan.
But they did say that in...
Right, the time of the Kriyat Shema is exact. Right. Amar Rabbi Yochanan said, Lo shanu ella kigon Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai v'chaverav shetoratan umanatan. This is only talking about Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai and his friends. Shetoratan umanutan, that their Torah is their occupation. In other words, all they do is learn Torah. So those people, aval kigon anu mafsikin the Kriyat Shema v'letfilah. But for us, we have to interrupt for both Kriyat Shema and Tefillah. In other words, if a person is totally devoted to learning Torah at the level that they don't do anything else, so that person is able to even skip the tefillah, not the kriyat shema, but he can skip tefillah. However, us, meaning the people in the Gemara time, since we interrupt to do our professions and to do other activities, so therefore certainly we have to interrupt in order to pray. That's an interesting issue. I don't know what they did with it. I guess they didn't have it, so...
Rabbi, this is still not Ur Chidush. That's exactly what they discussed.
No, because exactly what we're talking about in the Mishnah was about mincha. That you in mafsikin for mincha. So
any tefillah.
right now they're saying any tefillah really. If you're somebody who's Torah to umanuto, so then you don't have to do tefillah at all. But there's such a person doesn't exist today.
Because
Pretty
they
much.
had discussed also Arvid, where they say, where they had contrasted meanings with Arvid.
Right. That was different because that's going on the view that tefillah David is reshut, and therefore in certain cases you might not have to do it. But
so here
they're talking about a blanket statement about these individuals. Yeah. So now we say though that right, v'hatanya keshem she'en mafsikin latefillah kach en mafsikin lekriyat Shema. There's a braita that says just like we don't interrupt for the tefillah, we also don't interrupt for Shema. Ki tanehahi be'ibur shana. That's talking about the rabbis that gathered together for ibur shana, to determine the calendar for the year. Because Rav Ada bar Rava said, and so too did the elders of Hegronia say, Amar Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, reporting in the name of Rabbi Elazar bar Tzadok, Kishayinu osakin be'ibur hashana b'Yavneh, when we were in Yavneh determining the calendar. Lo ha'inu mafsikin lo l'kriyat Shema v'lo l'tefillah. We did not interrupt for kriyat Shema or tefillah because the Rambam explains it. He actually says somebody is osek b'tzorchei tzibur. If a person is involved in tzorchei tzibur, if he's learning Torah on his own, he has to stop for kriyat Shema at least. Even if he's Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai, he has to stop for kriyat Shema. But for the rest of us, anytime. But tzorchei tzibur, on this level of tzorchei tzibur, he wouldn't have to interrupt. So I would say that probably, there are very few instances of that, but I'm sure that Menachem Begin probably had many circumstances where he was exempt from tefillah and kriyat Shema because he was involved in tzorchei tzibur. Somebody, I'm just trying to think of an example of somebody who's concerned about tefillah. Right. That's another. Right, that's a good example. Yeah, chayalim today. Anybody who's involved in serious tzorchei tzibur.
Also gives nikud on Persians as chabar.
Oh, really? Okay. Oh, chabar. Yeah, could be. Like from chabura, because it caused a lot of suffering. Okay, the new Mishnah. Lo yetzeh hayat b'machato samuch lechashecha shema yishkach v'yetzeh. So the tailor shouldn't go out with a needle close to sunset because he might forget and carry it on Shabbat. Neither should the scribe go out with his pen. So there's somewhat of an ambiguity here. We'll see that it's fleshed out later. That it says two things. It says one should not delouse his clothing, because they used to get all kinds of lice in their clothing, which is, I guess some people might still get that today, but hopefully not around here. And he shouldn't read by the light of a candle. So there's two ways of reading this. It depends where you put the comma. Is it one should not delouse their clothing, comma, nor should one read by the light of a candle? Or is it you should not delouse clothing or read by the light of a candle? Both of them are to the light of a candle. We'll see later. What's the reason why you can't read to the light of a candle is because you might forget and adjust the candle. Back then they had oil lamps. An oil lamp, you might tilt the lamp so that the wick draws more light to give you more light because you're having difficulty seeing, and then you'll violate Shabbat, which we wouldn't want to happen. Be'emet amru, however, they said hachazan. This is not talking about a singing chazan, although he may have sung, we don't know. But this is the gabai of the synagogue. We would call this person the gabai today. It says that the chazan, meaning the gabai who's in charge of apportioning the aliyot for Shabbat, in those days he would have to check. Let's say this gabai didn't know what the parasha was of the week. He could go and look at what the kids were reading on Friday night, because the kids would study on Friday nights, and he could peek in to see what they were reading, so he could determine what the parasha was of that week. Because remember, they didn't have such fixed parashiyot week by week like we have today. It was different back then. So he would go and he would peek and see what they were reading so that he would know. Or some people say that it actually means he could go and look to teach the kids. The teacher of the children would go and see what points they were going to read from in order to tell the kids what to read. But he himself should not be reading by the light of a candle. And whenever it says in the Mishnah, Be'emet amru, it means this is the halacha. That even though they made this gezerah, that a person cannot read by the light of a candle, they made an exception built into the gezerah itself. Kayotzebo, similarly, this is only similar in the sense that it's a circumstance where a person could come to do an avera if they're not paying attention. Lo yochal azavi mazava mipnei hergel avera, a person who is a zav, who has an emission coming from his genital area, which is not, which is not normal, not a normal one. He's called a zav. or cannot eat with a zava, which is more than a nida. It's a woman who has even more than what would be considered normal for nida. He shouldn't eat with her at the same table because of hergel avera. Because if they start eating at the same table together, it's going to lead one thing is going to lead to another, and it's not prohibited for a woman to have relations with a zav, but it is prohibited to have relations with a zava. It's the same as nida. In fact, we treat all of our nidot today according to the rules of zava, which is a more strict rules. With the shiva neki'im, they have to wait the 7 clean days and so on. So what it means is that even though the man is impaired because he has this other condition, he shouldn't have an intimate dinner with this woman who is, I'm assuming his wife, who is a zava, because it might lead them to some kind of avera. That's why the halacha is in your idea that if you're sitting at a table with your wife and she's in nida, you're supposed to put something on the table to remind you that it's that time of the month. Tananatam, we learned over there in another Mishnah, Lo yamod adam b'reshut hayachid v'yeshteh b'reshut harabim. A person should not stand in the private domain and lean over and drink water that's spilling in the public domain. B'reshut harabim v'yeshteh b'reshut hayachid. And similarly, one should not stand in the public domain and lean over and drink in the private domain. However, if the majority of his body is in the place where he's drinking, it's okay. Obviously, the concern is that he's going to take some of the water with him into the reshut, into the domain in which he's standing. So if he's leaning from domain A into domain B, and the water's in domain B, the concern is he's going to bring the water over to domain A. But if the majority of his body and his head are in domain B, we're not concerned that he's going to go back to domain A with the water that he's drinking. No, what it means is that you're standing in Reshut Harabim and there's a water fountain in the Reshut Hayachid and you lean over. That's what it's talking about.
I really don't see the issue. What's the difference between...
I think
the concern is that you're doing an activity.
Are you transporting by having it inside your mouth or inside your stomach?
Right, so the Tosafot raises that problem. And they say that the stomach, the fact that the destination is your stomach is not an issue.
It's not an issue,
right.
It's in your mouth.
It's in your mouth, so it's okay. That's okay. So that's not the issue. The concern is that there might be somehow that you're going to end up carrying one. It's really a general issue.
You're going to go like this.
And you're going to bring some into the...
Take a ladle that's going to capture the water.
Oh, you're able to walk in Shugam at the same time? I didn't even know you could do that during the week. But really, it's in Yemen they taught that. No, but the Rambam. Okay, here's the point. What? Of course not. Yeah, of course not. Right. If there's no eruv, of course not. You're carrying gum. You can't eat food in your mouth and take it out with you. No way. Definitely not. It's in the Gemara later. But the point is that whether that way or the other. You can talk and walk at the same time, and you can rub your stomach and pat your head. Now, but the halacha that the Rambam brings is it's a general issue of standing in one reshut and doing an activity in another reshut. Standing in Reshut Harabim when your hands are doing something in the Reshut Hayachid or vice versa, because the concern always is that you're going to transfer something from one to the other. Now, it happens to be that the halacha that's in the Rambam the final halacha is that it's not true. You can do it. But that's what the issue is. It's a general issue of doing an activity in one reshut when you're standing in the other, because you might bring something from one to the other.
That it might be an issue of politeness and stuff like that.
Well, that's a whole other issue. We can't legislate that. We have to hope that people will have class and be polite. But so we turn to Amud Bet. V'chen bagat. Similarly with a wine press. Okay. Similarly, what with a wine press? It's not so clear. So they asked a question. Karmelit mai. So we know that you can't lean from a Reshut Harabim, or we're assuming so far that you can't lean from a Reshut Harabim to the Reshut Hayachid and vice versa, because if you were to carry from the Reshut Hayachid into the Reshut Harabim, or the other way around, you would be violating a biblical prohibition on Shabbat. But what about a Karmelit? Karmelit means that you wouldn't be violating a biblical prohibition. It would only be rabbinic. Because let's say the water fountain is in a Karmelit and you're in a private domain or a public domain. Okay, or you're standing in a Karmelit and the water is in a private or public domain. Even if you were to transfer something between the two, it would only be rabbinical, because Karmelit is a place that's only rabbinically prohibited to carry from. So, Amar Abaye Abaye says the same law, the same rule. Since you're not allowed to carry from one to the other, it doesn't matter that it's only rabbinic. However, Rava doesn't like that. Rava Amar, Hi gufa gezerah, va'anan nekom v'nigzor gezerah legzerah. You're doubling up on gezerot here. The fact that I can't carry from this karmelit to a private domain or public domain is itself only rabbinic. And now you're going to make a gezerah. You're going to make an additional decree that I can't even lean from the private domain into the karmelit or from the public domain into the karmelit because I might carry from the karmelit into the private or public domain when that itself is only a rabbinical prohibition. You're going to make a prohibition on a prohibition. I mean, there's no end to it. Right, so Amar Abaye said, Mina Aminala, I'll tell you where I got this from. It says at the end of the Mishnah, De Katani v'chen bagat, that it said, so too with the wine press. My gat, what kind of wine press is this? I Reshut Yachid Tanena. I Reshut Rabim Tanena. If it's already a Reshut Yachid or Reshut Rabim, so it's the same case as before. Why is it mentioning a wine press? Elalav karmelit. It must be a karmelit. So therefore, since it's in the category of a karmelit, for example, it has the dimensions that would make it not a Reshut Rabim, but not a Reshut Yachid, somewhere in the middle, so it's a karmelit. So therefore, when the person leans over onto the wine press to drink, he's leaning from a public domain to a karmelit, or from a private domain to a karmelit. So it says he's not allowed to do it. So that's where I'm getting it from. Rava Amar v'chin bagat linyan ma'aser. That's because, my friend Abaye, you don't understand what the Mishnah is talking about. Because it wasn't talking about the laws of Shabbat. There's another area in which leaning over something and drinking is significant, and that's ma'aser. Because the rule is that if you have tevel, you have untithed produce, for example, wine, and that untithed produce is in process. So biblically speaking, when does the obligation of ma'aser come into effect? Only once the wine is completely done, completely processed, and it's in the pit. What they would have is a wine press, and the wine press would spill out into a bore, into a cistern that would collect all the wine. So when it's in the cistern, for sure, you cannot take from that anymore, because it has to be, maaser has to be taken from it first. But when it's in the wine press still, and it hasn't gone down, okay, it's still in the process of being squeezed, and it has not yet been poured into the into the cistern. So you're allowed to take a little bit of it, and it's as long as it's only in an informal, not kavua way. The term that they use is kavua. It's not considered to be a kavua, a fixed, official eating, but it's like a snack. You can snack a little bit on it when it's unprocessed, even though it hasn't been tithed yet. So the question, when a person takes, if a person's leaning over the wine press and taking a little taste, that's considered okay. If they take a cup of it and they go over to sit in the, to sit and read the paper on the beach, that's considered kavua. That's considered already that they're seriously taking. All right, but if they're leaning over, so he's saying that's what it says. A person should not stand over. When it says standing over the wine press and drinking, okay, a person should be completely over the wine press. You shouldn't be standing in one place and drinking over the wine press that's in another place, because the concern is you're going to take that cup now and you're going to go and take it into the place where you are and sit down. If you're completely standing over the wine press and you're there and it's clear that you're just taking an informal snack, that would be okay. But if your body is in another location and you're leaning over to the wine press, the concern is you're going to take it, and then you're taking something in a kavua way, you're taking something in an official way that is not being tithed, and that's not acceptable. So, that's what it's talking about. And that's what Rav Sheshet said as well. As we said in the Mishnah, shotina lagat, a person who's standing over the wine press is allowed to drink from the wine press, ben ala chamin ben ala tzonen, upatur divrei Rabbi Meir. And that means that even if he mixes it with cold water, because remember, they would take that concentrated wine and they would mix it with water. So whether he mixes it with cold water or hot water, as long as he's standing over the wine press, which means he's just doing it informally, he's just doing it casually, he's not sitting down and having a real drink of it in the formal way, so it's allowed. Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Tzadok mechayev. Rabbi Elazar bar Rabbi Tzadok says no. Once you start diluting the wine and mixing it with water, that's not a snack anymore. You're already making a serious thing out of it. So whether it's hot or cold, it's no good. The Chachamim say, we'll make a compromise. If you diluted it with cold water, then we're going to say that it's okay for you to drink it if you're standing over the wine press, because you'll take whatever's left over and you'll pour it back in. But if you mixed it with hot water, okay, I've never heard of anybody having hot wine, but I guess it could be. So you're mixing it with hot water, so you're not going to pour it into the cistern now, because the cistern is not hot, it's cold. So we know that once you mix it with hot water, that you're going to take the entire amount that you siphoned off of the wine press, and you're going to take it for yourself. So therefore, it's no good, okay? But the point is, the point is either way, that according to this, what they're trying to determine is what is considered informal, casually tasting from the wine press, versus someone who is really taking from the wine press somewhere else. So just like if a person is casually dipping from the Reshut HaRabim into the Reshut HaYachid, and leaning over, unless he's fully over it, he's mostly in that domain where the water is, he can't drink because it doesn't seem like he's, the concern is he's going to take from that domain into the domain he's standing in. So too, if he's only leaning a little bit over the wine press, he can't drink because the concern is he's going to take from it and he's going to go sit down inside his house and drink from it, instead of just drinking it by the wine press. But if he's completely over the wine press, it's okay. The point is, though, this has nothing to do with Hilchot Shabbat.
Right.
That's the point, right? The bottom line is there's nothing to do with Hilchot Shabbat. It's a totally different situation where leaning over versus fully being there is a concern. Right. That's the only thing he's trying to show. Okay, Tzinan. We said further in the Mishnah, Lo yitzeh chayat b'machato samuch l'chashicha, shemei yishkach v'yitzeh. So the point is that you have a machloka between Abaye and Rava. Abaye is of the opinion that we could make a double gezerah here. It's no problem. Rava says no, it's not a double gezerah. So he rejects the interpretation that we would have a double gezerah. But what about the case in our Mishnah? The case in our Mishnah is that the tailor cannot go out with his needle on Erev Shabbat because he might carry it. But my love, the tchuva lo b'bigdo. Aren't we talking about a tailor who puts the needle in his shirt? They used to stick a needle in their shirt and walk around with it. And in that case, that itself is only rabbinically prohibited to go out like that because you're not really carrying it. It's stuck on your shirt.
So how does that relate
Okay,
to...
I'll tell you why. Because it's a gzera already. In other words, if it's a it's a rabbinically prohibited to walk out, for the tailor to walk out with the pin or the needle in his shirt.
So they brought this whole thing to explain the double gezerah?
This, exactly, yeah.
Wow.
That was why they brought this whole thing about leaning over from the Reshut HaRabim to the Reshut HaYachid. This was all because of the issue of double gezerot. So now we get to our actual Mishnah. Okay. So we have the same question. If the tailor goes out with the needle that's pinned into his shirt, that itself is only rabbinically prohibited. And now you're saying he can't go out that way even Erev Shabbat towards nightfall because maybe he's going to forget on Shabbat. But wait a second, even if he forgets on Shabbat, it's only rabbinical. So how can you make a rabbinical rule that he can't go out with it Erev Shabbat if then the concern is that he might do a rabbinical prohibition? That's a doubling up also. So, what? Well, that's going to come up. So, lo, tenakid le biyadeh. Obviously, when it says lo yetzeh ha-chayat b'machato, that the tailor shouldn't go out with a needle, it means he shouldn't go out carrying the needle, because he might forget and carry it. So since carrying it in your hand is biblically prohibited, he can't even go out right before Shabbat carrying it in his hand. Tashima. But what about this Baraita? Lo yetzeh chayat b'machato tchuva lo b'vigdo. But in the Baraita it says he can't go out with the needle in his shirt, meaning even if it's pinned in his shirt. And you just told me that would be a double gezerah, because he's not allowed to do that on Shabbat. It's only a rabbinical prohibition. And now you're telling me he can't even go Erev Shabbat like that because it's another rabbinical prohibition. My love, Erev Shabbat, doesn't it mean also Erev Shabbat he can't go out even with it pinned in his shirt? Lo, kitanya bish Shabbat. No, I'll tell you that on Shabbat itself is what it's saying. In other words, that Braita is referring to on Shabbat itself. He can't go out with the needle pinned in his shirt. But Erev Shabbat, we're not going to make a gezerah that since rabbinically he's not allowed to go out with it pinned in his shirt on Shabbat, therefore even Erev Shabbat he can't do it. We're not going to go that far. But what about another Braita? You can't get clearer than that. Clear as day. It says that the tailor cannot go out even before nightfall on Friday, even if the needle is pinned in his shirt. So Rava, what are you going to do with that now? If you're so sure that we don't have double gezerot, that sounds like a double gezerah. Because it's a rabbinic prohibition for him to walk outside with the needle pinned in his shirt. And you're saying that there's a rabbinical prohibition on top of that he can't even go out Friday evening before sundown like that because he might forget. That's a double gezerah? No, because Hamani Rabbi Yehudahi, that only is according to Rabbi Yehuda. The Amar Uman, Derech Umanato Chayav. Because according to Rabbi Yehuda, carrying, and everybody agrees that in order for carrying to be a biblical violation, you have to carry in the normal way. So he says that a professional has a way that he carries his tools that might be different than the average person. Rabbi Yehuda says he's still chayav. Hey, look, you're in the in the Gemara. The kisam shebeozno, velo sorek b'mshicha shebeozno, velo gardi beira shebeozno, velo tzava b'dugma shebetzavaro, velo shulchani b'dinar shebeozno. So all of these things are different professions. So for example, a tailor can't go with the needle in his shirt. The carpenter can't go with the measuring stick or the ruler type of stick in his ear. The person who ties bundles can't go with the rope that he uses, and the weaver can't go with the cotton that he uses, the special material that he uses, and the person who dyes fabric can't go with the example. He would have an example of fabric that he would carry with him in his ear. No. Velo shulchani b'dinar shebozno, and neither can the money changer go with a quarter or whatever. True, yeah. Vim yatza patur. If he went out, he's patur aval asur divrei Rabbi Meir. According to Rabbi Meir, if any of these people went out carrying these things in this unique way that's unique to their profession, so it wouldn't be a biblical violation. For Rabbi Yehuda, Omer Rabbi Yehuda says, Uman derech uminato chayav, ushar kol adam patur. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it's subjective. If in your field that's a normal way for you to carry it, even though it's not normal for anybody else, it's recognized as a carrying on Shabbat. According to Rabbi Meir, we only legislate forms of doing malachot that are universal forms, that everybody does. Okay? And most people don't carry this weird way in their ear. Okay? But only a professional would do that. So that's not counted then. Now, interestingly, Rashi says that that when they would carry these things, they weren't actually the tools that they used, but they were like advertisements. Like the tailor would go with the needle in his shirt to be like, I'm a tailor. The person who dyed fabric would go with like something on his ear to say, I'm a fabric dyer, and if you need some help, give me a call. It was the way that they advertised what their profession was. So that was why it was unique. It wasn't even really for the purpose of carrying the object from place to place. It was really an advertisement why would the shulchani put a coin in his ear? I mean, that's very strange. But the reason he would do it was to show people, I'm a money changer. So if you have any business that you'd like to do, give me a call.
My father, may rest in peace, had a hat, and inside the hat he had a mahat and thread for emergencies.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What would that?
That might be a problem on Shabbat if that were the normal way. If that were the normal way of carrying it, I guess.
I mean, it was very unique to me. I didn't know anybody.
Yeah, I never heard of that before. Yeah, I guess it would definitely not be biblically prohibited. That's for sure. Taneh chada lo yetzeh zav b'kiso. So anyway, what we concluded here was that the Braita that said that there's a gezerah, that the tailor can't go with the pin in his shirt or with the needle in his shirt erev Shabbat, lest he forget and carry it on Shabbat, was certainly talking about only according to Rabbi Yehuda. Because only Rabbi Yehuda says that carrying the needle in the shirt is a biblical prohibition. So we can go along and make another gezerah and say you can't even have it that way right before Shabbat. But according to Rabbi Meir, who's going to say that even if the tailor has it that way on Shabbat itself, it's not a biblical prohibition, he's not going to add another rabbinical prohibition on Erev Shabbat. Now we have Taneh chada lo yetzeh azav bekiso v'im yatza patur aval asur. V'taneh idach lo yetzeh v'im yatza chayav chatat. We have two opinions here. Now, what this is talking about is the Talmudic version of depends, basically. What they had was the Zav would have leakage, of his emission from his body. So they would collect it in a kis. He would put a covering over him, over his genital area to collect this emission that would come out. So the concern was, can he wear this on Shabbat? So one version said he shouldn't wear it, but if he does, is patur. It's not the normal way of carrying bags to carry them in your underwear, basically, for lack of a better term. And according to the other view, no, chayav chatat. If he does it this way, it's a violation. It is the normal way of carrying. So how do we reconcile these two sources? Amar Rav Yosef, lo kashya, ha Rabbi Meir, ha Rabbi Yehuda. One is Rabbi Meir, one is Rabbi Yehuda. Why? Because we just said Rabbi Yehuda says we look at your particular circumstance. Oh, you're a zav? Well, it's normal for a zav to carry the bag like this. Okay, if you told me, and you're not a zav, I like to carry my bags in my underwear, I'd say you're strange. But if you're a zav, that's normal for a zav. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, for the zav to carry the bag that collects this emission on Shabbat in his underwear is normal for a zav, so therefore we would say that's carrying. But according to Rabbi Meir, he doesn't particularize it. So since for the majority of people that's not a normal way of carrying things, even if for the zav it is normal, we don't care about that. We say it's not the normal way of carrying.
So for Rabbi Yehuda, you would have to make a shinui.
I guess, I don't know how he would do it. Or he would just have to stay home. Yeah, you would think so. They would have to stay home. I guess they would have to stay home, that's all. Well, until the time of Zav was over. But anyway, Amar le Abai says, "Emor de shamat le Reb Meir b'midid de lav hainu orche b'midei de hainu orche mishamat le." But wait a second. Here we're talking about something totally different. Abaye says we're not talking anymore about a professional. Like a Zav is not a professional. A Zav is somebody with a condition that anybody could have. Okay, and anybody who has that condition would do this. It's not like we're talking about a tailor, or we're talking about somebody who has a specific field that they're in that nobody else is going to imitate. Here we're talking about a condition that anybody who's a Zav could have, and anybody could be a Zav. So it shouldn't be the same. So because if you don't say that way, from this we could say, otherwise what are you going to say? That a person who is not a professional carpenter, who cuts wood, who cuts his piece of wood on Shabbat is not going to be chayav because he's not a professional? Because it's not normal for him to do that? He doesn't normally do that? So therefore we're going to tell him that his wood cutting on Shabbat is not a wood cutting. That's ridiculous. Obviously, if you do something in the way that's normal for anybody who would do it to do it, you did it. It happens to be that for a professional, he might have a style of doing things that is distinct and idiosyncratic, okay, for that profession. But for a person who is, for any other malacha, that theoretically, in your case, where it applies to you, you're doing it in the way that's normal. So for a Zav, any Zav, well, yeah, but it's not idiosyncratic because a Zav is not a profession. It's not like I am a Zav. It's my identity.
Every Zav who has an emission
would do this, right? But that's his point. He's saying just like if you needed to cut wood for something that you were doing in your house, even though you're not a carpenter, your cutting of wood is cutting of wood. It doesn't matter that, I'm not a carpenter, so my cutting of wood doesn't count. The fact that you're not a carpenter is irrelevant because you cut wood in the normal way that a person who cuts wood cuts wood.
No, but it became idiosyncratic for us.
But
until now we spoke about the outside Achnasa. Now we're talking about.
He's bringing another example. He's saying that, is it considered a shinui? Because the point is about shinuyim here, doing it in the normal way, right? So what is the normal way? The normal way is how that action is normally done. Not so. How do you normally carry a needle or a pen? You carry it in your hand. Okay, it happens to be that the tailor carries it in his shirt, but only a tailor would do that. Nobody else would do that. How do you normally cut wood? You cut it in a certain way. Anybody cuts it the same way. So it's not considered a shinoi just because I'm not a carpenter and I don't normally cut wood. That's not what it means. In other words, when we're talking about what a person normally does, it's a reference to the nature of the action, the way they're doing the action. Okay, so a Zav, anybody who is a Zav would carry out the container this way. Not anybody who carries a needle would carry it the way that a tailor does. So that's what Abaye is trying to argue here. So he says, since given that action, this is the normal way to do the action, for a Zav to carry this container or whatever it is in this way, and any Zav would do it that way, it's not something considered idiosyncratic, but rather normal under the circumstances. So therefore, the difference is that one is talking about a Zav who has seen 2 emissions of Ziva, and one is talking about a Zav that's only seen 3. Now what's the difference? Somebody who's seen 2 emissions is still not obligated in a korban. He's tamei, but he's not obligated in a korban until he sees 3 emissions. So as Rashi says, because since he needs the kis, he needs this covering in order to see if he has another emission, and therefore he might end up being a Zav that's required to even bring a korban. So therefore it's considered something that's normal for him to do. But a person who is not a Zav, who has already seen 3 emissions, therefore he doesn't need to catch any further emissions, because once you had 3, there's no reason to be worried about any more, because you can't get any worse than that. So for that person, it's not normal for him to go out with a kis, with something that is going to catch the emission, because it doesn't matter to him whether he has an emission or not. But then the Gemara says, but wait a second. Zav bal shederiyot dechayav mibayle debibayle lebdika. Zav bal gimel gat nami mibayle lesfira. But what do you mean? Even a Zav who had 3 emissions, still needs to check if he has any further emissions, because he has to count 7 clean days. The one who saw the 2 it has a lower status. But the one who saw 3, he also has to check if he has any emissions. So what's the answer? The answer is, if that very day he saw the 3rd emission, that Shabbat day, he saw the 3rd emission. So if he's only a Zav that had 2 Re'iyot, he only saw it twice. Then if he carries the kis out on Shabbat, if he has that container or whatever it is, that pocket that's to catch the emissions on that Shabbat, it's considered the normal way because he needs to see if he's going to have another emission. But if he had the 3rd emission on Shabbat, so then he can't get any worse that day, and he can't get any better that day because it can't be the first of the clean days because he just had the emission. So for that person to have that container in his underwear on Shabbat would be abnormal because it's not serving any function, and therefore it would be considered not chayav chatat. It wouldn't be the normal way of carrying it because it's not the normal circumstance. But wait a second. What about the fact that he doesn't want his underwear to get dirty? Is that not a noble purpose? Right? And therefore, even in that circumstance, it should be considered functional and therefore a normal way of carrying, because if a person has emissions, even if they are doing it not to catch the emission, but to protect their underwear, that's a totally valid reason for having this special kis that you're wearing. Amar Rabbi Zera says, Haytana udamar kol atzulei tinuf lo kachashiv. This is according to the Tana that says, protecting yourself from getting dirty is not chashuv. That's not considered a practical use. That's a negative. It's not a positive. You're not trying to catch the emission. You wish the emission didn't come at all.
Right. But here,
right.
Catch it.
Right. When you need to catch it for some reason, so then you actually need to catch it. But in the case, right, to inspect yourself. But when you're just doing a negative, you just don't want your underwear to get dirty, that's not considered significant. It's not, as we learned in the Mishnah, like we said, if somebody turns over a bowl on top of a wall, and the rain starts coming down, so what does this mean? Kiyutan means that if water falls on, in order for something to be mekabel tum'ah, we go over to Amud Aleph of Yud Bet, we're about to be done, but if water falls on, in order for food to be mekabel tum'ah, to be subject to impurity, to be vulnerable to ritual impurity, it has to have been wet. Okay? And it has to have gotten wet in a way that you wanted it to be wet. In other words, you had to have wanted the water. If you didn't want the water and it splashed on the vegetables, it doesn't count. You had to have wanted it. That's what bechiyutan means. So what he says is, if it's raining, and you take a bowl and you turn the bowl upside down, so what happens? The water comes down, and you don't want the water. You're just protecting the wall. You don't want the wall to get wet. So you took a trough and you turned it upside down so the whole top of the wall is protected. And now that water falls on vegetables that were in a bowl. So that's water you didn't want. You would have rather if it were not raining. You were trying to get rid of the water and it happens that now it fell on your vegetables. That's not bechiyutan. That's not water that you wanted. And therefore that's water that's not going to be machshir. It's not going to make the vegetables subject to tum'ah. However, if you said, hey, it's raining and I don't have a dishwasher because I lived 2,500 years ago, so therefore what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my vessels and I'm going to turn them upside down and I'm going to have a nice, the shamayim is going to be my dishwasher. So in that case, you want the water. You want the water. So since you wanted the water to clean the outside of the dishes, if that water now splashes onto your vegetables, that is water you wanted. But what does that show you? Atzulei tinuf, when you didn't want the water because you were protecting the wall from the water hitting it, that wasn't considered significant. That wasn't considered desiring. So there, similarly, when the Zav's only purpose in having this pocket is to protect dirtiness from getting on his underwear or getting on his clothing, then it's not considered significant. And if he were to carry it out in that way, it would be an abnormal way of carrying. It wouldn't be considered a constructive way of carrying. So that's why it says mida, but then it ends off, it says midami, it's not similar. Because hatam lo lahani mashkin klal. Because over there, when the rain is coming down, he doesn't want that water at all. But hachaka ba'elo lahaikis lekabule beziva. But here, the thing that he wants is not the emission. The thing that he wants is the container that he's carrying with him. And we're asking, does he want that container or not?
Wait, he doesn't want the container. He wants the emission because he wants...
No, we're talking about a case where he's just protecting his clothing from being dirty. Right? So in the case of the water, yeah, you made a nice distinction, but in this case, his reason, what we have to be concerned about is not whether he wants the emission or not. Our question has to be whether he wants the kis or not, whether he wants the container or not. And he definitely wants it, even if it's to protect his underwear. So wait a second. So rather, this is similar to the case at the end, where it says, dalaf letocha, mayim hanitazin v'hanitzapen enan b'chiyutan, v'shebetocha harizeh b'chiyutan. So what it says is that when water falls, let's say there's a leaky roof, and the water falls, and you're collecting the water in a trough of some sort. Okay, there's water coming down, and it's coming into this trough. So water that's inside that you're going to use because you caught it in this trough, that water is bechiyutan, is valuable. But the water that splashes out that you lost, or that overspills from the trough and falls on vegetables, that's not desirable. Okay, but what's the point? In that case, the water that you catch, even though maybe the reason you were going to catch it was because you didn't want the floor to get wet, still you caught the water and you wanted it. You wanted in other words, you wanted the vessel to be there to catch the water. Even though the reason, and so therefore we look at it as desirability, you wanted the vessel to be there to catch the emission, even though you would rather not have the emission altogether, but you wanted it to be there to catch it if it does come. So rather, what do we say? And we conclude here, Ella Abaye v'Rava d'Amri Travayu, finally Abaye and Rava can agree on something, La kasha ha-Rabbi Yehuda v'ha-Rabbi Shimon. This is the most basic machloket that we have in the entire Masekhet Shabbat, which is about malacha she'ena tzricha legufa. If a person does a malacha that they don't want, that they would rather not have. For example, the classic case, the easiest case is a person carries a corpse out of the house on Shabbat, from a private to a public domain. They didn't want to move the corpse to a new place. They wanted it out. They wish they didn't have the corpse. In other words, a malacha that you do because you wish you didn't have to do it. Okay, that's not really a constructive malacha. So that's a machloka between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says, Malacha she'ena tzricha legufa patur aleha, that since in this case he wishes he didn't have to have this container. He doesn't want to catch ziva emission. That's not something valuable to him. He just doesn't want his clothing to get dirty. It's a negative. So because it's a negative, that's not a malacha, that's not a positive malechet machashevet, that's not considered a positive malacha. So therefore he would be exempt. Rabbi Yehuda says, no. Even though his ultimate purpose is a negative, it's what he doesn't want. The truth is, whether or not he wants it, he's still doing an activity which is serving a purpose. It's purposeful. Even though the purpose is to remove a negative, it's still purposeful. And that's why, according to the one braita that said that if you wear this kis, if the zav wears this container in his underwear, even if it's to protect him from getting dirty, he's still chayav, because he's still doing something constructive. That's representing the view of Rabbi Yehuda. But the one that says he's exempt is Rabbi Shimon, because he says, even if you wanted the malacha, if the reason you wanted it was for a negative, to prevent something from happening that you really don't want, that's not considered a full-fledged malacha, and you'd be exempt.
That he is mutar, not patur.
No, because it said patur. In that second braita, it never said mutar. It said if he does it, he shouldn't go out, and if he does, patur of alasur. Right.
Oh, okay.
He's patur. Yeah. Have a great week, everybody.